In 2018, George R. R. Martin released Fire and Blood, a small fictional tale covering the first half of Targaryen history, which answered many questions fans had theorizing and discussing for many years, but also but also opened the door for quite a healthy amount of new ideas, questions, to the story. The most basic of which come from Fire and Blood's structure. Fire and Blood is not a narrative, it's a history book. It's written as a history book, an in-world history book written by a man inside the world itself, Mr. Gildane, who is a man who lives within the world of Ice and Fire. At the same time, Mr. Gildane's sources are mostly sources which exist within the world of Westeros. So many fans ask the question, can this man be trusted? Can these histories be trusted? Can what we read in Fire and Blood be taken as the real events that happen? Or perhaps there is some bias. Perhaps Gildane is not telling us everything. Perhaps Gildane is making choices about what he includes in his history book. Now, the answer to this is probably yes. Probably that's the intended consequences of having the book being written within the world. There's many contradictions between accounts. For example, Septon Eustace and mushrooms are two main sources for the Dance of the Dragons tend to disagree categorically in many situations. Now, the reason for Gildane's choices of what to include and what not to include is the real meat of the problem. There has been two camps over Gildane's bias and his mistakes as a writer. Camp number one is the null hypothesis. Yes, Gildane makes mistakes as a writer. Yes, Gildane is not a very good historian. Yes, the sources may be biased, but the bias can be explained without any sort of malicious intent or any sort of conspiratorial thinking. It can be explained through very simple logic. While source number two is one that tends to distrust the sources a lot more. It tends to think the sources are maliciously biased against some and for others. The sources are part of a conspiracy. A Grand Maester conspiracy. So, during the course of the next few videos, we're going to be talking about, can these sources be trusted? Can Fire and Blood be trusted as history and what really happened during those years of Targaryen history as it relates to the Dance of the Dragons and the Death of Dragons? But before we get there, we need to talk about the evidence within the main 5 A Song of Ice and Fire books. And this evidence comes in two main sources, Mr. Marwyn and Lady Dustin. Today we will focus on Mr. Marwyn's account since he is the better source, and also because Lady Dustin's accounts of the Maester conspiracy are less tied to Fire and Blood or the Dance of the Dragons, more tied to Robert's Rebellion, and besides, she's an interesting character on her own that I want to analyze on her own video, probably something smaller in scope. If I tell you, they may need to kill you, too. Marwyn smiled, a ghastly smile, the use of sourly running red between his teeth. Who do you think killed the dragons last time around? Gallant dragon slayers armed with swords, he spat. The world the Citadel is building has no place in it for sorcery or prophecy or glass candles, much less for dragons. Ask yourself, why was Aemon Targaryen allowed to waste his life upon the wall, when by his right he should have been raised to Archmaester? His blood was why he could not be trusted, no more than I can. Samuel 5, A Feast for Crows. Well, that was certainly a spicy take Marwyn was having. Now, is it true? This quote on first read seems quite reasonable. It comes from a source which would know the Mace's institution well enough. An Archmaester of the Citadel, one of the most high-ranking members and theoretically respected men within the institution. So, case closed. The Maesters are definitely conspiring to kill all dragons and Targaryens or something of the like. Well, let's reconsider who the source for this information is, Archmaester Marwyn. Now, Within the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, Archmaester Marwyn is mentioned for the first time within A Game of Thrones. The person who mentions the Archmaester is Mirri Maz Duur, the Lázarine witch and who Dany meets within A Game of Thrones, and who is responsible, maybe, video for another day, for the death of Rhaego and the death of Drogo. The second mention of Archmaester Marwyn comes from Qyburn in A Stone of Swords, where Qyburn reveals to Jaime that he and Marwyn were companions, and Qyburn also seems to be a man who distrusts the Maester's institution, for whatever reason. To be noted, Qyburn and Marwyn both use the same terminology regarding Maesters. So let's begin with the Mirri scene, since it gives us less information than we would want. It only tells us a few things about Marwyn. One, he was a semi-competent teacher of Mirri and probably magic, since that's his expertise. He traveled to the supposedly magic-filled city of Arshai, which we've never seen in the story itself, and Mirri seems to respect him to a certain extent. Now, Mirri is a woman who is obsessed with prophecy, namely with stopping the stallion who runs the world from coming into the world. Now, I say this because Mirri and Marwyn's view of prophecy / Targaryen / dragon seems to be different. Mirri did her very best to try and stop a Targaryen from being born into the world, though I have my doubts about that. Video for another day. While Marwyn seems very enthused about Targaryens and dragons being in the world. At the same time, Mirri was in the same pyre that birthed dragons during the Red Comet, while Marwyn links the same comet to the glass candles being back in the world. While the Qyburn reference to Marwyn in A Stone of Swords tells us a bit more about the sort of man Marwyn is. Say, Qyburn, unlike Mirri Maz Duur, who seems to be like genuinely not a bad woman besides killing a child, is a psychotic man who ran with a psychotic company of sellswords, who all of them were, to some extent, very much not good people. Qyburn also did not seem to object to any of the crimes of the brave companions, and himself has proven to be a man who is willing to do certainly horrific things. Like, for example, his experiments with the mountain. I bring this because the reason Qyburn despises the Maesters is because they stop him from practicing his arts / doing the experimentation he was doing before. Now, if Qyburn's experimentation with the mountain is anything to go by, and the treatment of the Stokeworths is something to go by, there's a very good reason why the Maesters probably didn't want Qyburn to practice this sort of science. Namely, it being horrifically unethical. Qyburn is a murderous man who tortures women and takes their organs and body fluids to be able to keep the mountain alive through probably some sort of necromancy or something else. So the Citadel would definitely have a reason to not want this sort of unethical experimentation, which has proven itself to be cruel and very unusual, to happen within its ceiling. Again, the expulsion of Qyburn, a crazy scientist from the Citadel who is also a psychotic man practicing spooky bullshit and also torturing people, who seems willing enough to go with Cersei's crimes or the Brave Companion's crimes, seems like an ethical choice. Again, we need to ask ourselves, was Qyburn expelled from the Citadel because of their dislike of magic? Marwyn, another man obsessed with magic, is still in the Citadel? Or was Qyburn expelled for the reason we're told he was expelled, opening the corpses of the living, and probably all the other unethical stuff we know he does from the Cersei chapters? So, if the reason Qyburn was expelled from the Citadel is the second option, namely his experimentation was, to some degree, very, very unethical, it would seem like the Citadel, as an institution, is very much ahead of its time, having some sort of ethics standards for its experimentation. Said ethics seems to include the not torturing people and opening their bodies. So we have two different students of Marwyn that we know of and who talk about Marwyn. The first of these two is Miri Mazdur, whose actions in a Game of Thrones are, at least according to her own interpretation of events, which I do not totally trust, that she attempted to murder Rhaego, an unborn child, against his mother's wishes because of who he might have become. This is to say, Miri Mazdur either killed a child or forced Danny to go through an unconsensual abortion of her son that was also fathered through rape, or at the very least attempted to do so. Again, regarding Miriam Asdur's treatment with Danny, we're going to talk about it in a different video. Then there's Marwyn's other student slash fellow maester who seems to like him a lot, namely Qyburn. So Qyburn is not an unethical man. He is a healer for probably the most brutal, violent, and psychopathic organization in the entire story, the Brave Companion Sellsword Company. At the same time, these people who Qyburn seemed to have no issues running with did things like the sexual assault of priests or children, which is bad. But even beyond that, his actions during his time with Cersei as Master of Whispers and as Cersei's resident mad scientist, including, are not limited to killing and dismembering a woman for her organs, so he can either do some necromancy and unwillingly bring a man back to life, or keep a soul of a horrible man alive and put him through endless amounts of torture for Cersei's sake. Both of these people, Qyburn and Miri Mazdur, both conduct themselves in a very, very unethical way and seem to be the sort of people who try to gather knowledge or use their knowledge in a deeply unethical way. Now, Marwyn, like his apprentice slash close acquaintance Qyburn, both are men who are seen as pariahs within the walls of the Citadel. Now, as we have explored about Qyburn, and we may do in a different video, there's a lot of reasons for Qyburn to be a pariah that are totally respectable and well-known reasons. Now, Marwyn himself is a man who is not very well respected within the Citadel and who is seen as a quack. Now, the truth about why he's seen as a quack, according to Marwyn, is because of his interest in magic and glass candles, something the Citadel wants to keep under control. But should we trust him? Qyburn calls the Citadel a band of followers who don't have much for inquiry, but we've seen that his methods of inquiry in operation are brutal and violate many of people's and violate the autonomy and well-being of his patients. While, like Marwyn, claiming that the Citadel are a bunch of followers and are the Grey Rats, they use the same terminology. So, should we trust Marwyn's reason for himself being a pariah within the walls of the Citadel? My answer is probably no. With all this said, let's actually go through his claims in Samuel 5, A Feast for Crows. The first claim that made me question Marwyn's story and his claims is about Maester Aemon. He says that if Maester Aemon had not been a Targaryen, he would have been able to rise to be Archmaester. Here's the thing. We do have an Archmaester Targaryen in the history of the Citadel. There's the son of King Jaehaerys, Archmaester Vaegon, who is key to the culling of the Council of 101. But beyond that, we know why Maester Aemon ended up at the Wall. It was nothing to do with him being disliked by the Citadel. It's just the simple answer that as a Targaryen and elder brother to the king, he would have been seen as a potential claimant to the Iron Throne during his brother's reign. Maester Aemon, purposely and by his own will, released himself to go to the Wall and take extra vows to not take titles for the sake of the realm, for the sake of his brother's reign. So that claim itself is not true, and is against what we have been told from Maester Aemon himself. Which leaves us with Marwyn's other claims regarding Targaryen history and the Citadel. Now, conspiracies regarding a elite group of intellectuals who are all part of the same organization changing history to cover up their conspiracy against a specific group of people who claim themselves to be magically or biologically superior because of their blood is a doozy of a claim. And even within the world of Ice and Fire would require a large amount of evidence. Evidence that we could only find through reading Fire and Blood. So, see you next time as we submerge ourselves into Fire and Blood and the death of dragons. Now, before you leave, guys, I would want to ask you for a little favor. This is to say to like and subscribe the video and share it around. It would help the channel grow quite a bit.